The earth groaned under a relentless cycle of bitterness. In the village of stone and clay, the air carried no warmth, only the sharp edge of competing voices. A female villager shoved past a merchant, spilling grain into the dirt, and did not look back. A male villager stood in the center of the square, shouting over a dispute about property lines, his face twisted in a permanent scowl. A child sat near a pile of debris, ignored by the rushing crowd, clutching a broken piece of pottery while the noise of the market surged around him. Noah stood at the periphery, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the heat rise from the dust. He saw the coldness in their eyes, a hardened indifference that settled over the settlement like a shroud. There was no mercy here, only the frantic momentum of selfish pursuits. He turned away from the marketplace, his boots crunching against the dry, parched soil as he walked toward the rising slope of the hills. The shouting faded into a dull drone, then silence. He left the stone walls behind, choosing the solitude of the high ground where the wind held no human malice. The climb became steeper as the ground turned from packed dirt to jagged limestone. Noah pulled his weight up with his arms, boots scraping against the rock until he reached the flat expanse of the summit. He knelt there, chest heaving from the exertion, wiping the dust from his forehead. The wind died instantly. The horizon, which had been a haze of heat, sharpened into a clear, biting line. Then, the light arrived. It did not come from the sun. It bled from the sky itself, a thick, golden fluid that pooled around him, warming the air until the scent of dry grass deepened into something rich and damp. Noah pressed his palms into the stone, his hands illuminating as the light intensified, pressing against his skin like a physical weight. The silence vanished, replaced by a resonance that vibrated in his very marrow. The Creator spoke, the sound not in his ears but within his mind, clear and absolute. Noah, make thee an ark of gopher wood, pitch it within and without. The command pulled at him. He did not hesitate. He bowed his head low, his spine arching in a slow, deliberate arc until his forehead touched the earth. "Yes, Lord," he whispered into the dirt. "I will obey." Noah descended the hill, his stride measured and heavy with the weight of the task. He entered his home, where the air felt stagnant, trapped between the thick stone walls. Noah's wife was kneeling by the hearth, stoking a dying flame, while Shem, Ham, and Japheth sat around the low table, mending leather straps. They looked up as he crossed the threshold. He did not sit. He stood in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over them, eyes reflecting the stark reality of the mountain summit. "The sky will soon break," Noah said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "A great flood is coming to consume the earth. We must build an ark." The room went still. Noah's wife stood slowly, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her brow furrowed into deep, jagged lines of sudden worry. Shem dropped the leather to the floor, his fingers twitching. Ham and Japheth exchanged quick, sharp glances, their chests rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. There was no movement in the house for a long moment, only the sound of the wind rattling the doorframe. The sons stared at their father, their eyes wide and clouded with the first stirrings of a cold, dawning fear that threatened to unravel their composure. Shem stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the packed earth floor. He gestured toward the door, toward the village path where neighbors walked. "People will laugh," he whispered, the words ragged. "They will call us mad. They will tear down everything we build before the first rain falls." Noah did not blink. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he could see the doubt etched in his son's jaw. "Let them laugh," Noah answered, his voice steady as iron. He looked toward the door, then back to his wife and his 3 sons. "The world mocks what it cannot see. We do not build for them. We build because the command was given." He placed his hand on the heavy wooden table, pressing down until the joints groaned. "We will obey." Noah's wife looked from her husband to her sons, her expression shifting from fear to a grim, quiet acceptance. She stepped to Noah's side, reaching out to touch his arm. Shem exhaled, a long, shaky breath, and lowered his gaze. Ham and Japheth followed, their shoulders squaring as the initial paralyzing fear hardened into a singular, immovable purpose. The silence in the room changed, shedding its fragility for the heavy, cold weight of duty. The work began at dawn, long before the sun had cleared the ridge. Noah led his family into the open field where the ground was hard and dry. They carried iron axes, heavy mallets, and coils of rope. The first massive beam of gopher wood lay on the earth, dark and dense. It took all of them to move it. Noah took the lead, his feet braced against the dirt, his shoulders coiled with effort. Shem, Ham, and Japheth gripped the rough grain of the timber, their knuckles turning white as they strained to lift the dead weight. They staggered forward, the wood biting into their palms. Halfway to the site, the beam tilted, slipping toward the mud. Noah roared a command, and they lunged, catching the weight before it struck the ground. Dust billowed around their legs. They grunted, lungs burning, and heaved it upward until it settled into the foundation trench with a dull, final thud. The impact vibrated through the soles of their boots. Noah wiped the sweat from his brow, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his wife and sons, then at the single, stark line of timber against the vast horizon. It was only the beginning, but the earth had accepted the first mark of their labor. By midday, the edge of the field was no longer empty. A male and female villager stood beneath the shade of a nearby acacia, their arms crossed. They pointed at the wooden frame, their movements jagged and impatient. The female villager spat into the dust, her face twisted in a sneer. "Look at them," she called out, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of the axes. Building a boat in the middle of a drought, laughter erupted, sharp and brittle, rattling through the dry air. The male villager leaned forward, clapping his hands together. "Perhaps the sky will turn to ocean for his sake," he shouted, followed by a mocking howl of amusement. Noah did not look up. He drove a heavy wooden peg into the joint, the mallet striking with a rhythmic hollow thud that seemed to ignore the noise entirely. He wiped his face with a forearm, his breathing steady, his focus narrowed to the grain of the wood. The villagers paced, their jeers growing louder as they sensed the lack of a reaction. They moved closer to the perimeter, their shadows stretching across the dirt. Noah reached for the next plank, his movements precise and unhurried. He stood at the center of their scorn, a pillar of silence against the rising tide of their amusement. Shem gripped the rough edge of the cedar plank, his fingers digging into the unyielding grain. Beside him, his wife braced her shoulder against the timber, her feet sliding backward in the loose soil. The wood was slick with heat and sap. It groaned under the pressure of their combined weight. Shem glanced at her. Her face was streaked with dirt, her breathing jagged and shallow. The plank shifted suddenly, tilting toward the ground with a sharp, heavy jerk. Shem lunged, catching the underside before it crushed his toes. The impact jarred his entire frame. He grunted, his muscles screaming under the sudden tension. His wife did not pull away. She planted her heels, locked her arms, and pushed back with every ounce of her resolve. They held the weight together, their eyes locked for a heartbeat, a silent exchange of endurance amidst the dust. With a final, synchronized heave, they shoved the timber into the frame. It locked into place with a heavy, resonant thud. They stood there for a moment, chests heaving, palms raw and stinging. Shem reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. They did not speak. They simply turned back to the stack of wood, ready for the next piece. Noah's wife moved between the rows of timber, carrying a heavy skin of water. Her movements were deliberate, each step calculated to avoid the discarded nails and jagged wood chips littering the ground. She reached the central workstation where Noah's family sat in the sparse shade of the hull. She set down the water and began laying out bowls of grain and dried fruit. The wind picked up. A sudden, hot gust that swept across the field, carrying a thick cloud of red dust. It stung, turning the air opaque in seconds. Shem's wife gasped, shielding her eyes. Noah's wife did not retreat. She grabbed a heavy canvas cover and pinned it against the gusts, using her weight to anchor it over the food. She braced her legs, fighting the wind until the air settled back into a heavy, still heat. She stood, brushing the grit from her apron, and handed a bowl to Japheth. She moved to the edge of the site, collecting the tools left scattered in the haste of the wind, stacking them neatly by the base of the ark. Her presence was a steadying force, a quiet rhythm that balanced the chaotic pace of the construction. She returned to the center, watching the men prepare for the afternoon, her gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting for the next need before it arose. Japheth stood at the base of the hull, a heavy iron ladle in his hand. The cauldron beside him bubbled with a thick, viscous black tar, sending pungent, acrid plumes of smoke into the stagnant air. His wife stood ready, holding a bundle of coarse brushes. She dipped one deep into the pitch, the liquid clinging like ink to the bristles. They worked in a practiced, relentless cadence. She applied the tar to the seams, and Japheth followed, pressing the mixture deep into the gaps with a flat wooden tool. A gust of wind caused the cauldron to shift on its stones. Hot, black droplets sprayed outward, landing inches from his wife's feet. She jumped back, her breath hitching, but did not drop the brush. Japheth kicked a support beam into place, stabilizing the heat source with a sharp, controlled motion. He looked at her, his jaw set, and nodded. They focused back on their task, their hands moving with renewed speed to seal the wood before the pitch hardened. The smell was suffocating, filling the space between the planks until every crevice was slick and dark. They worked until the sun dipped low, their movements becoming a blur of black smears and rhythmic strikes of the hammer, ensuring the structure would hold against the coming tide. A young boy, barely 7, drifted away from the marketplace noise. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide as he looked up at the towering wooden ribs of the structure. He took a step forward, his fingers twitching with the urge to touch the rough, pitch-stained surface. To him, the massive skeleton was not a folly, but a wonder rising from the earth. He stood motionless, his mouth slightly parted, watching Noah's family move along the scaffolding like shadows against the sky. The silence of the boy's admiration was shattered by a sharp grab at his shoulder. The female villager loomed over him, gripping his arm with enough force to make the boy wince. The villager pointed a calloused finger toward the village center, her face twisted in a sneer. "Do not look at that madness," she growled, her voice carrying clearly toward the workers. She yanked the boy backward, the child's feet dragging in the loose dirt. The boy cast one last glance at the ark before he was forced behind a cluster of huts. The construction site returned to its rhythmic, lonely labor, the gap between the builders and the villagers widening with every strike of the hammer. The seasons cycled with ruthless indifference. Summer heat baked the dust into a fine, stinging powder, while winter rains turned the construction site into a quagmire of thick, clinging mud. Through every shift in the sky, the ark continued its slow climb toward the clouds. Noah moved differently now. His stride had lost its spring, and the beard that once framed his jaw had turned silver, trailing down his chest like spun frost. He stopped often, leaning against the massive hull to catch his breath, his hands calloused and trembling slightly as he traced the grain of the gopher wood. The structure had become a mountain of its own. It cast a long, permanent shadow that stretched across the valley floor, swallowing the village in its reach for half the day. Plank by plank, the 3-storied frames solidified, dwarfing the surrounding trees until they looked like mere weeds against the timber wall. The sound of the hammer had become a constant, rhythmic pulse in the air, a heartbeat that ignored the jeers below. Noah climbed the highest scaffolding, his movements deliberate and stiff, and looked out over the horizon. The work was far from finished, but the shape of the coming salvation was finally undeniable against the pale, dusty sky. Noah descended the ladder, his boots crunching heavily on the dry earth. He walked until he stood just inches from the edge of the workers' perimeter, where the male and female villagers waited with arms crossed. The air between them was thick with dust and hostility. Noah raised his voice, his tone steady despite the heat. "The time for indifference is ending," he stated, pointing toward the vast structure behind him. "Turn your hearts back to him before the sky changes." The female villager spat on the ground, a sharp, wet sound that cut through the silence. "Build your toy, old man," she laughed, her voice cracking with derision. The male villager stepped forward, leaning into Noah's space, his face tight with contempt. "The sun burns, the dust stays dry, and you are a fool," he shouted. A small group gathered behind them, their faces masked by the same cold amusement. They did not listen. They did not look at the sky. They turned in unison, retreating toward the village center. their laughter rising in a dissonant chorus that swallowed Noah's final words. He stood alone in the clearing, watching them retreat, his plea lost in the wind that stirred nothing but the dry, dead dirt at his feet. The sun hung like a copper weight in the sky, draining the strength from the air. Ham dropped the heavy mallet, the sound dull against the sun-baked wood. He wiped a mixture of sweat and grit from his eyes, his chest heaving with every shallow breath. "How long?" he asked, his voice raw. He gestured toward the horizon, where the land remained parched and lifeless. "We build, we seal, we carry, and for what?" Shem leaned against a support beam, his hands hanging limp at his sides. The silence from the others was heavy. Noah's wife moved to provide water, but her own movements were slow, her shoulders hunched against the relentless heat. Shem's wife and Japheth's wife exchanged a look, their faces etched with the same exhaustion that gripped the men. Japheth looked at the massive, empty hull, his grip on his tools loosening. The wood felt brittle under their touch, cracked by years of exposure to the unforgiving heat. The mockery of the villagers outside had faded, replaced by a more dangerous silence within the walls. They were tired of the dust, tired of the labor, and most of all, tired of the waiting. The ark stood as a monument to their commitment, but in the shimmering heat, it looked increasingly like a grave for their lost years. Noah saw the weariness in their posture, the way Japheth stared at the ground rather than the work. He set his own tools aside, the iron clinking against the wood, and raised his hands. "Gather," he said, his voice cutting through the stifling heat. The command was not loud, but it possessed a weight that demanded movement. Shem, Ham, and Japheth stepped away from the beams. The wives joined them, forming a circle in the center of the structure. Noah stood at the heart of the group, his gaze sweeping over each face until their eyes locked with his. He did not speak of the heat or the mocking voices outside. He placed his palms firmly on the rough timber floor, grounding himself. "We are not builders of a boat," Noah stated, his tone steady and resonant. "We are keepers of a promise." He reached out, taking the hand of his wife, who then took the hand of Shem. The chain formed, fingers interlacing, sweat slicked and calloused. Every heart slowed its racing. The doubt that had clouded their vision began to retreat, replaced by a singular, sharp clarity. They were not working for the approval of men who could not see the horizon. They were working for the Creator. As Noah bowed his head, the entire family followed, their collective breathing stabilizing, the exhaustion in their limbs giving way to a quiet, ironclad resolve. The resolve lingered in the air as the family moved. Noah pointed toward the storehouses, and the brothers began the long, rhythmic haul. Shem and Ham hoisted heavy sacks of dried grain, their steps synchronized, while Japheth and the wives organized bundles of hay into the lower decks. The interior of the structure became a hive of motion. They stacked crates against the inner walls, securing each one with rope, testing the knots with sharp tugs. Noah's wife oversaw the inventory, her hands moving with precision, ensuring every container was sealed tight against moisture. There was no more talk of doubt. The urgency had entered their bones. Suddenly, the stifling heat that had defined their lives for years vanished. A cold, sharp breeze swept through the open bays, rattling the timber joints. Noah stepped to the threshold, his palms flat against the wood. The horizon had shifted. The sky seemed to press lower, heavy and gray. He turned back, nodding to his family. The final bundles were pushed into place. Every stall was ready. Every shelf was full. The wind grew louder, whistling through the gaps in the hull, and for the first time, the family stopped and listened to the silence of the earth outside. Noah stepped down the final ramp, followed by his family. They turned to face the work of years. It loomed over the landscape, a massive, three-storied testament of timber and pitch that blocked out the sun. The structure was silent, its sheer size dwarfing the surrounding hills. Noah's wife pressed a palm against the hull, feeling the solid, unyielding resistance of the wood. Shem, Ham, and Japheth stood with their heads tilted back, their eyes tracing the massive beams that climbed into the graying clouds. The structure did not sway. It did not groan. It stood as a singular, immovable object in a world that had forgotten how to look up. In the distance, the marketplace continued its frantic, selfish pace, voices rising and falling, entirely unaware of the mountain of wood that had risen in their midst. The family stood in a tight, silent line. They did not speak. Their breath hitched in their chests as they surveyed the height of the prow and the depth of the sealed seams. It was finished. The weight of the command had been met with the weight of the work. For a moment, the only sound was the wind catching the sharp, vertical edges of the ark, vibrating like a held note, waiting for the world to change. The ground beneath their feet ceased to be solid. It started as a low, deep-throated hum that traveled up through the soles of their boots, a rhythmic pulse that made the dirt dance. Noah felt the vibration first, his heels digging into the soil to maintain his balance. His family mirrored the motion, their shoulders tensing as the tremors grew more pronounced. The air in the valley thickened, pressing against their skin with a static charge that made hair stand on end. In the distance, the marketplace noise faltered. The female villager stopped mid-stride, her hands dropping the wares she had been bartering. The male villager looked down at the earth, then toward the horizon, his face tightening in sudden, sharp confusion. A child stood frozen in shock, eyes wide in disbelief, pointing at the dust clouds rising from the path. The jeering had died away, replaced by a collective, nervous shifting. No one understood the source of the shaking, yet everyone felt the sudden, crushing weight of the atmosphere. The birds had vanished from the sky. The wind held its breath. Noah stood motionless, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the earth to reveal what was coming next. A movement appeared on the distant ridge, a steady stream of shapes breaking the horizon. It started with the heavy, rhythmic thud of elephants, their massive forms stepping with surprising grace toward the field. Beside them, lions moved with a strange, unnatural calm, their shoulders rolling in stride with lambs that walked at their flanks. Noah's family retreated, clearing the path as the wildlife flowed around them. Shem and Japheth stood motionless, their hands pressed against their chests as the creatures passed. Ham watched as birds descended, wings beating in synchronized waves before settling on the wooden beams. There was no sound of struggle, no predatory instinct, only a singular, focused migration. Every creature moved in a pair, guided by a force that felt like a magnet pulling them toward the yawning entrance of the ark. Noah's wife watched in silence, her eyes tracking the steady flow of life that ignored the structure's looming size and climbed the ramp with purpose. The air grew dense with the scent of pine and wild earth. Creatures that once feared one another stepped onto the wood in perfect harmony, disappearing into the dark interior. The family remained at the edge of the clearing, witnessing the impossible, as the steady, unending line continued to emerge from the dust. The light across the valley drained away. Above, the sky curdled into a deep, bruised purple, heavy and thick. The wind picked up, shifting from a low whistle to a sharp, aggressive howl that tore through the trees. Noah felt the sudden drop in temperature, a cold snap that bit into his skin. He stood firm, watching the horizon. Near the edge of the field, the male and female villagers looked up, their jeers silenced by the unnatural shift in the clouds. The mocking laughter that had persisted for years vanished, replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed confusion. A child stumbled, reaching for a hand, as the first heavy, fat raindrops slammed into the dry dust. They hit the ground with the force of stones, kicking up small clouds of dirt that swirled in the rising gale. The villagers scrambled, their movements erratic and desperate, retreating toward the safety of their homes. Every drop that struck the earth left a dark, widening circle in the parched soil. Noah did not blink. He turned to his family, his expression unyielding, as the sky unleashed a low, rolling rumble of thunder that shook the very foundations of the valley. The time for words had ended. Noah gestured toward the ramp. One by one, the family moved forward. Shem and his wife stepped onto the wood first, followed by Ham and his wife, then Japheth and his wife. Noah's wife took one last look at the darkening valley before crossing the threshold. The interior was vast, dim, and filled with the low, steady breathing of the gathered animals. Noah stood at the very edge of the opening, his hand resting on the rough, pitch-covered timber of the frame. The wind outside roared, a wall of sound that threatened to tear the structure from its moorings. He stepped inside. The great door, massive and heavy, did not move by his hand. Instead, a sudden, Powerful force took hold of the wood. It groaned a deep, resonant vibration that traveled through the floorboards and into the soles of their feet. The door swung inward with unstoppable momentum. It slammed against the frame with a final, echoing thud that cut off the howl of the gale. The world outside vanished. Darkness pressed against the seams, thick and absolute. They were no longer part of the valley. The silence inside was heavy, held in place by the weight of the sealed wood, as the first torrent of rain began to drum against the roof above. The sky shattered. It did not merely rain. The heavens opened as if a dam had burst, dumping a solid wall of water onto the landscape. Inside the ark, the sound was deafening, a relentless, percussive roar that vibrated through the very marrow of their bones. Noah pressed his hand against the inner wall. The wood shivered under the assault. Outside, the world was dissolving. The paths that had led to the village were gone, swallowed by a frothing, rising gray tide. Water climbed the clay walls of the homes, rushing through doorways and turning the village into a churning pool of debris. The villagers struggled in the rising current, their cries lost beneath the thunder. The flood surged with violent, liquid force, slamming into the hull of the ark. Every impact sent a shudder through the structure. The ark groaned, a deep, mournful sound, as the water clawed at its sides. The dry earth was history. The valley had become a dark, churning ocean. Noah looked at his wife and his sons, their faces pale in the dim light, as the roar of the deluge consumed everything. They were safe, but the world they knew was being erased by the tide. The rhythm of the rain changed. It was no longer a strike against the roof, but a surrounding, deep-seated vibration. Water surged around the base, pooling rapidly against the heavy timbers. Then came the groaning. It started in the floor, a long, agonizing shriek of wood being pulled from the mud. Noah braced his feet against a support beam, his hands locked onto the rough, wet surface. The entire structure tilted violently to the left, throwing the family against the inner partitions. Shem grabbed Ham, and Japheth pulled his wife close as the floor lurched beneath them. There was a sickening, suction-like sound, the earth refusing to let go, followed by a sudden, jarring release. The ark lurched upward. It was a physical jolt that knocked the breath from their lungs. They were no longer standing on ground. They were floating. The massive vessel bobbed, then leveled out, drifting on the surface of the rising tide. The sensation of weightlessness was brief, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic rocking of the water. Outside, the world was gone, replaced by the dark, churning expanse of an ocean that had no end. Noah looked up, his grip on the beam white-knuckled, as the ark began its slow, steady climb above the drowning landscape. Inside, the air grew thick and stale. Noah gathered his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives into the central hold. They sat on the floor, backs pressed against the vibrating beams, huddled close to the flickering warmth of hanging oil lamps. The rain was not just sound. It was a physical weight slamming into the roof, a relentless, deafening barrage that rattled the teeth of everyone inside. Above them, a seam in the timber groaned and began to weep, thin ribbons of water snaking down the wall. Shem reached out, pressing a handful of pitch into the gap, his fingers trembling as the wood buckled under the pressure of the wind. Ham and Japheth moved to hold the support beams steady, their shoulders straining against the sway of the vessel. The lamps swung in arcs, casting long, frantic shadows that danced across the faces of the terrified group. Every time the ark pitched, the animals in the lower stalls let out low, mournful cries that echoed through the hold. Noah watched the light catch the golden oil, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. They were trapped in a wooden shell, suspended between a vengeful sky and the rising deep. They did not speak. They only held on, waiting for the fury of the storm to exhaust itself. The relentless hammering against the timber roof tapered off. It did not stop all at once, but slowed, the thunderous roar thinning into a sporadic, hollow tapping. Then, silence. It was an absolute, heavy silence that pressed into the ears more aggressively than the storm ever had. Noah stood, his muscles stiff from days of bracing against the sway. He moved toward the upper hatch, his hand trembling slightly as he unlatched the heavy wood. The door creaked open, admitting a slice of gray, diffused light. He climbed the ladder, his head emerging into the open air. The sky was a pale, washed-out slate. There was no wind. There were no clouds. Below him, the water stretched in every direction, a vast and glassy mirror that swallowed the horizon. The landmarks, the hills, the forest, everything they had known was gone. The world had been erased. Noah stood on the deck, his breath visible in the damp, cool air, watching the gentle rise and fall of the dark expanse. Behind him, the others climbed up one by one, their faces pale as they looked out over the void. The ocean was motionless. They were adrift in a silent, empty universe, the only living things left upon the face of the deep. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light. Noah turned to his sons, his face etched with the weariness of their long confinement. "We must know if the earth has begun to surface," he said. He moved to the cage where the black-feathered bird paced restlessly. With a steady hand, he opened the latch and lifted the creature toward the gray expanse. The raven took flight, its wings beating a sharp, rhythmic sound against the oppressive stillness of the air. Everyone watched as it grew smaller, a dark speck against the endless, featureless horizon. They waited. The silence of the ocean seemed to expand, swallowing the minutes. Then, a black shape appeared in the distance, circling back. It did not carry a sprig of green or a branch. It circled the ark twice, its calls harsh and lonely, before it circled back to the deck, unable to find a single patch of dry ground to settle upon. Noah reached out, his hand open as the bird landed on the wood near his feet. It had found no rest. The realization settled over the family, heavier than the rain had ever been. They were still suspended in the middle of a drowned world, with no sign that the land would ever return. The weight stretched into another day of suffocating stillness. Noah stepped forward once more, this time lifting a dove from its perch. He held the small, white creature for a long moment, feeling the frantic beat of its heart against his palm, before tossing it gently into the sky. It spiraled upward, catching a thermal, and disappeared into the pale haze. The family remained on the deck, their eyes fixed on the horizon until their vision blurred. Hours crawled by. Then, a speck of white broke the gray monotony. The dove returned, flying lower this time, its flight path steady and purposeful. As it descended toward the deck, Noah saw the flash of green held firmly in its beak. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and caught the bird as it landed. He pulled the small sprig free of fresh, vibrant olive leaf, damp with the mist. "Look!" he shouted, his voice cracking. A collective gasp broke the silence, followed instantly by a roar of pure, unbridled joy. Shem and Ham surged forward, grabbing each other by the shoulders, while Noah's wife pressed her hands to her face, tears carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. The stifling weight of their isolation shattered, replaced by the electric surge of hope. The echoes of their joy had barely faded into the rafters when the rhythm of the world changed. The constant, subtle sway that had defined their lives for months vanished. Instead of the gentle roll of the deep, a violent shudder vibrated through the floorboards. It started as a low groan of timber, escalating into a screech of wood against stone. Noah braced himself against a support beam as the entire structure lurched upward. A deafening, grinding roar filled the air, the sound of the ark's hull fighting against an immovable object. Everyone was thrown off balance. Shem and Ham stumbled, clutching the railings as the vessel tilted, then slammed back down with a final earth-shaking thud. Then, absolute stillness. The familiar sloshing of water against the sides ceased entirely. The ship did not move. It did not drift. It sat, firmly anchored. Noah stepped toward the center of the deck, his feet meeting a surface that no longer shifted beneath him. He looked at his wife, then at his sons, their faces pale with the suddenness of the transition. The long, agonizing migration through the void had reached its conclusion. They were no longer floating in the middle of nowhere. They were resting on the solid, unyielding peak of a mountain. Noah moved toward the massive, pitch-sealed door, his pulse thrumming in his throat. He set his shoulder against the wood, bracing his feet against the floorboards. The heavy timber groaned, resisting his weight, but he pushed harder, his muscles straining until the seal finally snapped. The door creaked open, swinging outward with a slow, heavy rhythm. A rush of crisp, cold air flooded the interior, carrying the sharp scent of wet stone and clean mountain mist. Noah stepped onto the threshold, his eyes widening. Outside, the world had been scrubbed raw and beautiful. A vast expanse of mud-slicked rock and emerging green stretched toward a horizon that shimmered under a pale, clearing sky. No debris, no remnants of the old world remained. He looked back at his wife and his sons, then gestured toward the ramp. The animals were already crowding forward, sensing the change in the air. A lion stepped out, its paws sinking into the soft, damp earth, followed by a pair of birds that took flight into the quiet morning. Noah followed, his boots making deep impressions in the mud. He paused, exhaling a long breath that hung in the air like steam, watching as the rest of his family emerged into the silence of a world reborn. Noah left the ark behind, walking until he found a rise of land that looked out over the receding waters. He stopped, his gaze falling upon the damp, dark soil. He dropped to his knees, pressing his palms flat against the earth, feeling the grit and the cold moisture seep into his skin. He began to gather stones scattered by the recent torrent, selecting each one with deliberate care. He stacked them in a circle, then a square, building upward until a rough, waist-high structure stood before him. His wife stepped up beside him, followed by Shem, Ham, and Japheth. They carried more stones, their hands moving in silence to help him finish the work. The air was thin and still, lacking the oppressive weight of the storm. Once the altar was set, they did not speak. They gathered around the pile of stones, sinking to their knees in the mud. Noah bowed his head, his knuckles resting against the rough rock. His family followed suit, their shoulders touching, their breathing synchronized in the quiet. They remained there, motionless, their faces turned toward the earth in a collective posture of gratitude. The chaos of the past was gone, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of a world given a second chance. Noah remained bowed, his palms still pressed against the cold stones of the altar. The silence was absolute, until a change in the air drew his eyes upward. Above the peaks, the heavy, bruised clouds began to fray at the edges. A beam of sunlight pierced the mist, striking the moisture-laden air with sudden, intense clarity. A streak of color appeared faint at first, then deepening into a vibrant, multicolored arc that stretched across the clearing sky. It spanned the horizon, a brilliant bridge of light connecting the earth to the heavens. Noah stood slowly, his joints stiff, and turned to face his wife and sons. They were already watching the sky, their faces illuminated by the shifting spectrum of red, gold, and violet. The light reflected in their eyes, erasing the shadows of the long voyage. Noah reached out, resting a hand on the shoulder of his nearest son. He looked at each of them in turn, seeing the exhaustion of the past replaced by a steady, quiet strength. The air felt different now, thinner, cleaner, and full of potential. The promise was etched in light, a permanent seal against the void. In the vast, quiet expanse of the new world, they stood together, their presence marked by the colors above. They were no longer adrift. They were home.